first speaker is Donna Fishman. She's currently co-chair of the Jewish Coalition Against Sex Trafficking, JCAST, Chicago, and is a founding member of the coalition. JCAST Chicago works to eradicate sex trafficking in the Chicagoland area through public awareness, community engagement, and advocacy. Inspired by Jewish values, JCAST Chicago partners with interfaith and human rights groups, nonprofit organizations, government officials, and law enforcement groups. Donna also serves as chair of the Illinois State Policy Advocacy Network for the National Council of Jewish Women, NCJW, Chicago North Shore, where she tracks policy initiatives, mobilizes members and supporters of NCJW to advocate for progressive public policies, and executes advocacy events. She recently organized over 250 Jews for a Shabbat service and meetup at the Women's March in January 2017. Ms. Fishman has over 30 years of experience in public health. You won't believe that when you see her, but 30 years experience in public health and maternal and child health. She worked as a consultant to nonprofit organizations. I have about 50 years of experience in general, and you can actually easily believe that. She worked as a consultant to non-policy organizations specializing in program development and education, school health policy, and grant writing. Her specialty areas are adolescent pregnancy prevention and childhood obesity prevention. She's now a senior planning associate at the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago. Thank you very much, Donna.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank Dr. Brensikoff and really Lauren, who weren't in here when he thanked you. We've become best friends from all our emailing back and forth and getting this arranged, and all of you for being here. So I am from JCAST, the Jewish Coalition Against Sex Trafficking, and I would like to thank, there's a couple of trustees here from the Jewish Women's Foundation of Metropolitan Chicago, and we are thrilled to be in our third year of receiving grant funds from the Jewish Women's Foundation that funds Jewish organizations running programs for and about Jewish girls and women. So we're really so pleased. So everyone, thank you. So thank you for coming. First of all, can everybody hear me? Am I okay? All right. I don't want to sit down because I'll feel too short, and I don't think I'll cover that. So JCAST was founded in 2014. And we were founded by the National Council of Jewish Women. You heard that in my bio. And the National Council of Jewish Women was actually founded in 1893 here in Chicago. We are the oldest Jewish women's organization in the country. And we have been a progressive Jewish organization working on social issues for almost now 125 years. And interestingly, the issues that we have worked on, I guess interestingly and sadly, we're still working on some of the same issues. So why did NCJW get involved with sex trafficking in this form of modern-day slavery? From the beginning, we have worked on issues of refugees and immigration, and we have worked on issues of keeping young women and adult women safe from violence. And so this really fit within our portfolio of a lot of the projects we were doing around domestic violence. And so that is why we founded JCAST. We started learning about sex trafficking from the organization of one of our other speakers from the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. And if you're not familiar with CAASE, you need to be. So Melissa will introduce CAASE, but I want to make sure a lot of our statistics are from CAASE that you know about them. And in a moment, you'll see a video featuring the founder of CAASE. And so so we founded JCAST because sex trafficking is really commercialized domestic violence. It is violence, intimate partner violence, perpetrated, under the guise of making money. And so we were startled, shocked, as you might be. Some of you might already be aware of what a large industry this is. So what I'd like to do to start is show you, just kind of sets the tone. About 40 NCJW sections and chapters across the country are working against sex trafficking. In New York, the New York City section is working in coalition with other organizations and held a conference a couple years ago. And they produced this video for the conference. It's national in scope. So I would like to show you that. Lauren. I have to escape out of here, right? Yeah, okay.
Sex trafficking is ultimately the undermining of an individual's dignity.
Sex trafficking is when people engage in prostitution against their will, through force, they're beat up, they're raped, through fraud, they're tricked into doing it, or through coercion. And I think the coercion thing is actually really important. Maybe it might mean that their family has been threatened. Maybe it's that someone is blackmailing them.
It is modern-day slavery. It isn't happening someplace far away. It's happening in our own communities.
It's in every state of the United States. It is sadly alive and active and continuing to enslave vulnerable members of society.
It's so unconscionable that we just can't imagine that it's real. And so even when it's right before us, we don't want to see it, and we maybe even can't see it.
Sex trafficking is not an isolated issue from the Jewish community. Jewish men and women are trafficked, and Jewish men and women are also buyers of sex.
The buying and selling of human beings violates one of our core principles as Jews, that every human being has inherent divine worth, and that slavery is immoral and must be fought.
Sex trafficking is a human rights violation, and we all have a responsibility to help those who are hurting in the world.
The first step towards fighting sex trafficking is awareness, becoming aware of the issue that's all around us, that's happening here right in our own communities.
Teach our boys, teach our husbands, teach our brothers that the purchase of sex is absolutely unacceptable. It's a demand-driven industry, and if we ignore the demand, the side that's bringing in people to be trafficked, then we're not going to win this battle. So our efforts have to be not only focused on helping victims rebuild their lives, but on holding perpetrators accountable for the fueling of the sex trade industry.
We need to look at our systems and see where we're complicit in sex trafficking and what we can do to change it. It's going to take the work of great activists and policymakers and leaders, and also average people like you and me to really make a difference.
Sex trafficking is abuse of the divine image into which every human being was born.
Sex trafficking is heartbreaking.
Sex trafficking is the ultimate violation of a human being.
Sex trafficking is my responsibility to end.
Sex trafficking must be stopped. UJA Federation of New York and its Task Force on Family Violence has brought together Jewish and other frontline organizations to mobilize a Jewish community response to end this scourge.
That really gives you a great background and a lot of the statistics. And so I think you really heard why the Jewish community is involved with this. It is our responsibility to help people who don't have a voice and to free people from slavery. And we really are talking about slavery. So my goals today, which I'm going to quickly get through in my 17 minutes, clear up any misconceptions, misperceptions, and in every audience, people have some misperceptions, expand your awareness about sex trafficking, and increase your commitment to getting involved on the issue. And I think all of us are going to be talking about that. So as they said in the video, for the definition of human trafficking, and human trafficking, as you might know, is made up of labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So two distinct, but all under the umbrella of human trafficking. There has to be force, fraud, or coercion. And what I'd like to point out on this slide is it's not all force. So when you think of slavery and you think of enslavement, and you might think of people being handcuffed, and that's not always the case. What we see is it's very similar to domestic violence, where there's a lot of fraud and coercion. I'm going to come after your family, similar to what they said on the video. So I'm going to come after your family, or I'm going to kill you if you don't stay here with me. And so there's a lot of deception, withholding wages. As you might know, as you probably know, in the field of prostitution, that most prostitutes, most people who are prostituted have to turn over all of their income, which is why you saw that huge statistic on the $150,000 per victim that the pimps and traffickers are making. So people who are prostituted, and I want to clear up that, make sure you know that it's both men and women, boys and girls. It is not just women who are trafficked, it is also men and boys, and that's very important to know. So, just, you know, how do I tell the difference? And I don't want to really get into this, but, you know, human versus sex trafficking, we're talking about sex trafficking is part of human trafficking, but it's really when people are sexually exploited through sexual exploitation. And so that is really important. And then also to know that part of the definition of sex trafficking nationally and internationally is that anybody under the age of 18 can never be arrested, cannot be seen as a perpetrator of a crime of prostitution. They are seen as victims. So anyone under 18 can never be arrested. And as you know, prostitution is illegal in all states. So how big is the problem? You, again, heard some of this already. It is a huge $150 billion shadow economy, second only to arms in this country. JCAST, really, we only talk about domestic sex trafficking, and so you've probably heard about women and men being brought in from other countries, but actually 83% of victims of sex trafficking in this country are U.S. citizens. So this is not, we think we're putting our emphasis on the right place because it is the majority, and we really want to have an impact here in Chicago. So we're really working with people here in Chicago. So human trafficking, again, this broad labor and sex trafficking really happens everywhere. The locations on here, the industries, are not specific to the map. So it's just showing the breadth across the country. And I like to say to people, you know, how many of you ever eaten in a restaurant? So that's everyone. So just because you don't frequent brothels does not mean that that you haven't been in a place where there is some trafficking, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking. That's probably happened, and we know these are places in Chicago where this is happening. So let's take a look right in Chicago. Estimates, and this is from CAASE, wide range. As you can imagine, this is a very hard issue to really pinpoint and get exact statistics. So somewhere between 16 and 25,000 people every day, women and, I think it's women and children, are sex trafficked each day in Chicago. That is a tremendous number. We are a national hub because of O'Hare, because of sporting events, because of conferences here. So we are a major hub of trafficking, which does not mean that it's not happening in other places. Rockford has a big problem, and Melissa can tell you some of the other places, cities she's working in Illinois. So it is everywhere. We know it's happening on the North Shore, in the western suburbs, southern suburbs, everywhere in the whole metropolitan area. Key to this is really looking at the homeless and runaway population. So I have another slide that we're going to look at about who is victimized. But I wanted to start with a story. And here is a local story. Read it to yourself, someone who was born, is from Chicago, suburban Chicago. I'll give you a second. So if I had more time, I would have a little discussion about what you're seeing here, but what I want to point out is that 98 to 100% of people who are victimized by sex trafficking were sexually abused as youth. So there is a very direct connection there between what happens, and that really, what I want you to think about is what can we as professionals, as lay members, the Jewish community, what can we do to help prevent childhood sexual abuse and then to treat victims, and so as they grow up, they don't become re-victimized into sex trafficking. And as you can see here, sadly, she was getting pimped out by a family member. That doesn't always happen, but we know, obviously, that it does sometimes happen. So let's talk a little bit about who is trafficked. And as they talked about in the video, the supply side, the demand side, I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about the supply side. And I know that Melissa is going to talk a lot more about the demand side. So we know that the majority are females. LGBTQ youth, male youth, very, very vulnerable. Often they're getting kicked out of their homes, their parents aren't accepting. So the issue is kids who are isolated, disengaged, who run away. So that's an issue we see a lot. Group homes, I'm sure most of you are aware of from the Tribune, of DCFS and the investigation of group homes. Group homes are fertile grounds for recruiting young women into sex trafficking. And that is a real issue that we all need to be working on. Basically what's important to know is that when young people, and you saw the average age was like 12 to 13 to 14, when young people get involved in sex trafficking and prostitution, it is not a choice. Nobody chooses to sell their body for sex and to make money that way. It is what we call in the field is called survival sex. And it is because they have no other way to have a place to stay and pay a cell phone bill and to have a meal and really to survive. So if someone runs away from home, they're on the streets, they are sort of easy prey. So let's take a look at who then the traffickers are. And the traffickers are what we call the pimps and the people who are sort of above that in the organizational structure. And it could be a relative, it could be someone else. Interestingly, most of the traffickers have also been a victim of abuse, men and women. It's not just men who are traffickers. Some are organized criminals, some not. We know this problem is happening in gangs, and gangs even in Chicago, we've heard from law enforcement, are sharing young people. So done in this neighborhood, go to the next neighborhood, and they're actually cooperating around this issue, which is interesting. So it's a very sophisticated, you can tell by the $150 billion industry how sophisticated this is. So how do traffickers work? Some of you might be thinking kind of the old model of streetwalkers, and that really doesn't happen anymore. Most trafficking and finding young people who are prostituted or adults who are prostituted is happening through the internet. And how many of you have heard, and you're saying you've used it, but how many of you have ever heard of Backpage.com? So some people are familiar. So Backpage.com it's like Craigslist, and it has listings of, 14-year-old, virginal, whatever it is, let us know. And so Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart, you might have heard, is very active on this issue, and he actually got Backpage to stop taking credit cards for advertising of persons in this way. And so we've had some success in that way, but that is the vast majority of cases. That is how prostitution is getting advertised and how people are getting sucked into trafficking. And so we know that people who are involved in trafficking are victims of violence in over 70% of cases by a John or by a pimp or a trafficker. So these are just some of the ways. So let's turn to the demand side. And the photos up here are from a recent sting in Arlington Heights. And again, Sheriff Tom Dart has started the National Day of the Sting. He's been doing it in Cook County. The sheriff in Lake County has done stings, and then across the country now we are seeing this in other municipalities, clearly here in Arlington Heights, where they're posting pictures of buyers. 97% of men who buy sex, and I would say 99.9% of the buyers of sex are males. 97% have a higher education, they have a long-term partner, and they have disposable income. We know that, and I've seen mixed statistics, I'm not sure what you use, between 1% and 5% of men in this country at some point in their life will buy sex. So it is a small number, which means 95 to 99% of men do not buy sex and can be what we call upstanders and really join with us to make sure that we're getting the message out that it is not okay to purchase sex. We know that the average age of first purchase is 21, and so that's the average, which means it also happens younger. And what we hear mostly about are fraternity parties and bachelor parties, sometimes men, dads buying their kids sex for the first time is a rite of passage. Interestingly, these aren't people who you necessarily think of as sex addicts. They're buying 2 to 3 times a month. And there are estimated 250,000 purchasers every year in Chicago. These statistics are from CAASE. So it's an interesting profile, and CAASE has some real, I don't know if you mentioned, really interesting data. They did studies of online sex purchasers. And they have some really, really interesting statistics. So here is one of the stories, and I'm just going to read it for you. Once picking up a girl, don't know if she was a pro or not, but she was dressed in civilian clothes, mid-20s, standing in the middle of the street on Toohey and McCormick. People know where that is, on the north side. On the north side. She was holding a sign that said she was recently laid off seeking help. Offered to get her food at the McDonald's on Toohey, and it led to some great sex for $60. The scene was not of a John picking up a pro, but rather just civilians helping each other. Isn't that what we all do? So there's so many more stories like this that are even more horrifying. But this is typical of what I read from that study, at least. And what we are hearing is that it's men who feel they deserve it. Either they look at a lot of porn and their partners won't do what they're seeing in porn that they want to do. They feel like they deserve it, and I think most said in this study as to why you purchase sex. What do you think the most typical answer was? Because we can. Because I can. Because virtually, and this is what Melissa's really working on, there are no consequences. So what is really driving that demand? So we talked about sort of the individual profile. I want to look more community-wide from a societal perspective. The culture of objectification of women, especially in the media. And then I got to add the current political atmosphere recently to my slides. And that has really, really had an impact. And we're really hearing that. I have a daughter who's 17, and she's telling me about some of the comments that she has heard directed towards her, what girls should and shouldn't be doing. And it's horrifying. I'm hearing it from people in their 20s, and some of you might also have stories. Pornography, the average age that boys start looking at porn is 11 years old. And no matter how many controls parents put on their devices, it is virtually, from what I'm hearing, understanding, it is virtually impossible to completely cut off access to internet porn. And so I think we really have to keep that in mind. This is just an idea of the culture we live in, pimp and hoe parties. This is something in Chicago. So I urge you to all be upstanders and get involved with us. I left a sign-up sheet outside. Really hope you will get involved with JCAST. We do public awareness, we do advocacy. We're really trying to engage Jewish people. So in addition to raising awareness, one of the things we're doing, and Connie, right? I want Connie to raise her hand, maybe you'll have a chance to talk to her afterwards. Connie works with an organization called Selah Freedom, and they have recently opened a safe house treatment home here in the Chicago area. And so we are funneling volunteers there who want to do direct community service helping victims. CAASE does some of that work. There are a lot of organizations. Our role, we really see, is helping to end demand by doing this public awareness and helping people to understand their role, my role as a mother, as a worker in an office, to looking at demand, what causes demand, and how we can all impact it. So I hope you will join us. And thank you so much. So does anyone have any pressing questions? Did I do a statistic wrong that didn't make sense, which is highly likely, before we move on to Heather? Yes?
Are there any areas of the city that are more hotspots than other areas? North, south, east, west?
Great question. So we know that, and Lisa might have more information on this. So my understanding is that many of the victims come from the south and west sides. The purchasers come from all over. So we know, for instance, a couple of years ago, I think it's already been, there was a sting in Lake County, and they published some of the pictures, and there was actually a Jewish guy that people who we were showing this to knew. And so we know that the buyers come from all over, and there are hot spots. Who showed the slides? I don't remember if it was you. There was a panel on sex trafficking in Evanston last month, and Evanston, Skokie, I mean, there were a few hotspots, hotels that had been pegged where they know this is happening. So a lot of the back page ads are meet at a hotel. And so that's how they usually set up stings, but that is a place where you meet. Again, you're not seeing people meeting on the streets, they're hotel meetups. So I can get you that information, because I know I can't remember whose slides those were, but come up to me afterwards and I'll take your name, and I will, that's a great question. So it is happening metropolitan-wide. So I do, nobody's immune. This really can't be a not in my backyard kind of thing. We are all responsible for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donna. And the second speaker is Heather Ross, who's a partner with Ross and Zuckerman LLP. Since 2005, Ross and Zuckerman represents clients solely on the legal issues affecting alternative family options, including egg donation, sperm donation, embryo donation, and surrogacy. The partners at Ross and Zuckerman have represented thousands of intended parents, donors, and surrogates. Prior to this position, Ms. Ross was a senior attorney with the Legal Assistance Foundation of Metropolitan Chicago, where she represented low-income clients in various civil matters, including family law and juvenile court, and she directed the Women's Law Project, which focused on educational outreach and advocacy work on behalf of low-wage working women. She's a member of the American Academy of Assisted Reproductive Technology, the American Bar Association Family Reproductive and Genetic Technology Committee, American Society for Reproductive Medicine, American Fertility Association, and Resolve. Ms. Ross also served as a volunteer attorney for the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, assisting sex trafficking survivors. She currently serves on the steering committee of JCAST Chicago and co-chairs the Women in Justice Committee of Congregation Hatafa. Thank you very, very much for coming, please.
Hi, I am going to sit down. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the laws that have been passed in Illinois over the last 6 or 7 years to try to combat this horrible problem of sex trafficking that Donna gave you a great background on. Probably the biggest proponent and advocate for so many of these laws was CAASE. And we're really lucky today because we have Melissa here from CAASE, who, after I touch briefly on the laws that have been passed, she's going to talk a little bit about what we're doing to, what they're doing to enforce the laws and some problems that we're encountering. I'm going to try to fly through some of this because we've got a lot to cover and not a lot of time. So here are 6 laws that have been passed in the last 6 years. And again, I think one of the best things that CAASE did was to start this End Demand campaign and recognize that although victims and survivors of sexual assault absolutely need to get services, the focus cannot be on that alone. If we're going to try to eradicate this problem, we really have to look at the demand side and do things to end the demand. All right, the Illinois Safe Children Act passed in 2010, and I know Donna talked a little bit about this, but interestingly, Illinois was the first state in the U.S. to make all children under the age of 18 immune from prosecution for prostitution. Okay, so essentially it removed from the criminal code juvenile prostitution. Minors that are involved in the commercial sex trade are considered abused and neglected children. And if a law enforcement officer encounters such children, a report must be made to DCFS and an investigation must occur within 24 hours. These kids can not be sent to jail, thank goodness, but instead, they can be sent to a foster home or to a hospital, and services are set up for them. In addition, prostitution-related offenses, which were targeting pimps and johns, were enhanced from misdemeanors to felonies. So it is now a Class 4 felony. And it limited the availability to use the affirmative defense as, well, I didn't really know what her age is. I mean, it still is available, but it's much more difficult to use. It also increased vehicle impoundment fees that can go along with being caught. from $200 to $1,000, and the act expanded the wiretapping authority for criminal investigations. All right, in 2011, Illinois Justice for Victims of Sex Trafficking Crimes Act was passed. This enables victims of sex trafficking to clear their records of prostitution convictions. And Illinois was the third state in the United States. This represented a significant shift, okay, that recognized that trafficked individuals are not criminals, but they're persons who are victims of a crime. Of course, the significant result of this statute is that, you know, once you've got a conviction like this on your record, it's really hard to get gainful employment. If you're working through your immigration status, that can really put barriers for those proceedings. It makes it so you could never like adopt or foster a child. So being able to clear records is really important to survivors of the sex trade. So what does the petitioner have to show? They have to show that they're receiving either services right now or they're out of the sex trafficking industry. They have to state in their petition, when they petition to the court, why they didn't present facts initially. And even though there's no time limit, you have to exercise due diligence in coming forward to get the conviction removed. So what kind of evidence does a victim have to provide? They can just go back and open the records for their court case. Often within the records themselves are going to show that, you know, they were victims. I think number 3 is really significant, and that they can provide a sworn statement from a trained professional staff, either of a victim services organization, an attorney, a member of the clergy, someone who is helping them seek assistance in the trauma they've experienced. And alternatively, the court can consider any other evidence the court deems is sufficient. All right.
Excuse me, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Just as a practical matter, let's say someone comes to you in the year 2017, and she's in a job training program, and she says, I have this on my record. So it's been 6 years since the law has been passed. She's done nothing about it. So you're saying there's no statute of limitations, so that person, you could advise that person, you know, put together a support letter or something so you can go back to this sponge?
I would refer them to CAASE to talk to an attorney. I believe that is correct, but I think the offense may have had to happen after a certain year.
After 2011?
No. But I think it was before that, but I think it had to maybe be after 2004. I don't remember exactly the day. Do you know, Melissa?
So felony, there's 13 years in Illinois where you could get a felony prostitution charge, which Heather will kind of talk about in a minute. So you basically would have gotten that felony conviction within that time frame because it didn't exist before or after.
All right, then in 2012, the Illinois Human Trafficking Code was reformed to improve essentially the effectiveness of the trafficking statute from 2006, and also to help generate more resources for survivors. So here there was a big shift and change in the law, because in the 2006 Act it talked a lot about like force and physical restraint, when in reality so many people who are trafficked, even though there is a ton of violence absolutely in this field, often the pimps, the johns, they don't even have to resort to violence. So it changed the definition of involuntary servitude to any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the person to believe that if the person did not perform such labor or services, that person or another person would suffer serious harm or physical restraint. And then it defined serious harm as any harm, whether physical or non-physical, including psychological, financial, or reputational. So most importantly, it deleted definitions and references to forced labor and servitude. 2013, Illinois eliminated felony prostitution. This is what Melissa was just referencing. It amended the criminal code, basically, to eliminate all felony sentence enhancements. This obviously was significant because, again, felony convictions make it very difficult to do things like seek employment, adopt, foster a child. It also ensured that people facing misdemeanor prostitutions were eligible for mental health programs. It encouraged services through the Mental Health Court Treatment Act, which was also amended, and it mandated that court programs establishing these specialized programs partner with service providers. What was interesting before this law was passed, studies were done showing that the felony prostitution convictions were really gender-based. In other words, when something was busted up, when a prostitution ring was busted up, most of the time it was all the women who were being prostituted out were taken and arrested and charged and convicted of felonies. And the Johns, the pimps, the users, they weren't. So it also really became this big gender disparity, and it wasn't doing anything to alleviate the problem of the demand of prostitution, and it was expensive for the state. All right, in 2014, a fund was created, housed at the Illinois Department of Human Services, from which grants were made to support the development of special services for trafficked and prostituted people, things like emergency houses, long-term safe houses, community-based drop-in centers. The reality is that there's almost no safe houses or beds right now in the state of Illinois to help survivors of sex trafficking. I'm thrilled that Sail of Freedom has come here and opened somewhere for survivors of sex trafficking to go to, but there's nowhere near enough. So fines imposed against people that are convicted should now be going to this fund, and that should go more directly to services directly for survivors. In 2015, an affirmative defense to prostitution legislation was passed. This now allows defendants who are charged with prostitution to raise it as an affirmative defense. Prostituted people report very, very high rates of violence and control from their pimps and traffickers. So this was really important because it enabled people who were arrested and brought to court to use this as an affirmative defense. Illinois law was trailing behind other states by the time this law was passed. Very important with this law is that it allows a defendant to go back in the judge's chamber outside of the courtroom to provide testimony. Studies showed that pimps and johns would often show up at the court hearings, and sometimes they'd even intervene, so the prostituted person is fearful for her safety and her life, or when she is released if she's taken back into custody. So this enabled them to be able to feel safer, and they just have to show that they think there's a safety concern for themselves or for someone in the courtroom or someone they know. All right, so I think it was last year the Human Trafficking Resource Center notice was passed. This requires posting of a national hotline number. Here is an example of a posting in public places. And this act was actually somewhat controversial within the community seeking to eradicate sex trafficking. The reason for that is because there's just not enough services out there. So the fear is that a woman who's being trafficked sees this poster somewhere, runs away from her abuser, calls the number, and there's really nowhere for her to go. So there was some pushback from different organizations who didn't necessarily support this getting passed yet. I suppose the flip side is with having these posters, I don't know, have any of you seen anything like that posted anywhere in Illinois in the last year? No? Yeah, I believe you. Is that it's promoting public awareness. I mean, what was shocking to me is how many people still have no clue that this is happening. It's the second biggest industry next to firearms. I mean, it's bigger than the drug industry, and people have no idea it's happening. How many minutes? Okay. All right, the Survivor Support and Trafficking Prevention Act. This dealt with helping foreign-born victims of trafficking. They're often eligible to legalize their immigration status, but it can take a long time. And throughout this process, they're not getting any services yet, and so they're very vulnerable to being trafficked yet again here. This act was passed, I think, in August. Let me check my notes, and it's going to go into effect January of 2018. And essentially, it's going to fast track some of these benefits, so these people will be given more similar to like a refugee status. The Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, this became effective this past January, and basically it amends several acts, the minimum wage law, the Human Rights Act, to make sure that domestic workers have the same rights as all other workers in Illinois. All right, I just want to take a minute to talk about what rights do survivors have, and there are several ways they can go after their abusers. So the first is a civil no contact order. This is a finding in civil court that your perpetrator sexually assaulted or sexually abused you. It's a stay away order. So the perpetrator has to stay away from you, and you don't have to have a relationship with the perpetrator to obtain this, and you don't have to file a police report. So the benefit obviously is one of safety. Your perpetrator has to stay away from you. I think it also empowers survivors to bring their perpetrator to court, whether they show up or not, but to get a public statement saying, I was sexually assaulted by this person. There's the Gender Violence Act. This allows survivors of sex-based violence, so like domestic violence, sexual assault, to sue their attacker in Illinois State Court for injunctive relief or monetary damages. You have 7 years to file suit. The Predator Accountability Act. This allows survivors of the sex trade to seek civil damages from individuals and businesses that either recruited, harmed, profited from, or maintained them in the sex trade. And this act does have an attorney's fees provision, otherwise probably there wouldn't be too many attorneys who would do this pro bono, but basically if you're successful, then the defendant would have to pay the attorney's fees. I'm about to pass everything over to Melissa, but if you are interested at all, especially if you're an attorney and even if you're not, CAASE has a great pro bono project that connects private attorneys with local survivors, and they've got lots of different programs. Some don't require court intervention at all. It's advocating with survivors as they go through, filing police reports and getting interviewed, and they have wonderful trainings all over, so take a look at their website if you think you might be interested. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. I just have a quick question for Donna and Heather. The two presentations that you have up with, are they available online?
I'm happy to share.
Yeah, so maybe we can share with people who register, because there's a lot of information there that's very important to see. So the third speaker, now we have a lot of time for questioning, so you don't have to, Melissa, if you feel that you want to say something that go beyond 20 minutes, that's fine as well, because we'll still have plenty of time for questioning. What we're going to do is after Melissa finishes, we'll have 3 chairs up here from the 3 panelists, and we can just take the questions from here if you don't mind. But Melissa, and I'm not sure it's Banerjee? Melissa Banerjee is a policy associate for Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, which is CAASE, as you heard. Melissa joined the policy staff at Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation in October 2015. CAASE's policy team works to transform the state's criminal justice response to commercial sex and human trafficking, to focus on those who create demand for commercial sex, reduce the legal burden on survivors, and hold pimps, buyers, and traffickers accountable. Melissa is currently spearheading the strategic planning process for CAASE's statewide policy implementation work. Her responsibilities include promoting community and institutional support for survivor-specific services, building local alliances with survivors and advocates in target communities, and advising a broad range of stakeholders, including law enforcement, policymakers, and court personnel on best practices relating to sex trafficking, prostitution, and rape. Please.
Sure. Better? Can you hear me? Better? Yeah. Okay. So, hi, I'm Melissa, and I work at CAASE. Thank you for having me today. So, at CAASE, our mission is to address the culture of the individuals and the institutions that perpetrate, profit from, or support sexual exploitation. And we do that in a number of ways. We have our legal team that Heather just referenced, who works to give free legal services to survivors of sexual assault and sex trafficking. We have a prevention program that goes into local high schools and works with young men to make them aware of the broad range of what sexual exploitation is and how they can not be a part of that cycle. And we have our policy team, and we do work to change laws to better support survivors of sexual violence. And so I work under the End Demand Illinois campaign, and the End Demand Illinois laws, or the EDI laws as I'll refer to them, are the first 6 laws that Heather just beautifully described. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but you do have a handout that you picked up that kind of gives you, to help you remember. And these 6 laws were a massive effort by a large group of people working together. We had community partners who organized around this issue. We had legislators that were able to carry the bills, and most importantly, we worked with survivors who informed the language of the laws, and they told us what needed to be in law and what they really needed. So the vacatur law, as Heather said, was because survivors told us it's really hard to function with all of these convictions on my record, and my life is so different now. So can you help me? And our state said yes. So after we passed these laws, it became very apparent that laws are only as effective as the people in the systems using them. So we shifted our focus to implementation, and that's where I was hired and I came in with a background in community organizing. And so the goals of our implementation are really the same as of the entire campaign, which is to redirect local law enforcement attention away from from prostituted people and onto exploiters, pimps, buyers, and traffickers. And we do that, and the second goal is to expand the system of services available for prostituted people. And so we think the law that's really going to move the ball on this is our fifth year law, or the special fund that Heather talked about earlier that's housed at IDHS. And for that fifth law to be effective, we need a few different things to happen. We need law enforcement to arrest or cite buyers, arrest traffickers and pimps. We need them to work with prosecutors to get convictions. We need judges to impose fines and fees on the people who are convicted. We need the clerk of the court to appropriately collect these fines and fees and have them deposited into that fund at IDHS, which is actually a really complicated process I'll talk about in a second. And we need DHS to work with communities and survivors to, when there is money in this fund, appropriately allocate it to survivor-based services, services that are informed by survivors in communities all over the state. So it's a heavy lift. And what it takes, so we are looking at it in kind of 2 separate buckets. There's our community work that I'll talk about that's in a second, and then there's the more obvious task of training court personnel, law enforcement, and judges on the fact that these laws exist, how to get that money into the fund. And so we have hired a training coordinator who works with me in different communities to get these trainings together. We call the local state's attorney's office, and we ask if we can just sit down and have a conversation about why these laws passed and the benefits to the local community, which are that a portion of those fines and fees go to local law enforcement.
so it is also a way for local communities to support this work. The second bucket of work is a little bit more complicated because it requires a lot of relationship building with folks who are invested in this issue. So the first thing I have to do is find out who cares and why do they care. And so that might look like folks that work in group homes that are very aware of the fact that there are pimps, that circle around looking for vulnerable young women, or a local YWCA that has that same experience working with that same population. It could be social workers in schools. It could be rape crisis centers that interact on a regular basis with people who are both survivors of prostitution and sexual assault. And to bring those people to the table with law enforcement and share their experiences and let me know what does the commercial sex trade look like here. So I am from near East St. Louis in southern Illinois, and there are 24 strip clubs in St. Clair County. And everyone in that county is very aware that this exists. Law enforcement knows, the prosecutors know, but they know what happens there. There are service providers I've talked to that work with women who work in the clubs, but they just really, they don't know what to do about it. So the goal of the work there is, but we did have a really great, they had a really great state's attorney who has been very vocal about wanting to deal with sexual violence in his community, and he said that publicly. So what I do is pay attention to what's going on in a town that's very close to where I'm from, and call people that I know and ask them, who do you know that cares about this issue? And then we all come together and we talk about it. And so after a year of trying to get this meeting with the state's attorney, we got it. And now we get to do a training with them and connect them to the other folks that we've been talking to since we started working down there. And so that's kind of what the community-based work looks like. And the point is to build an accountability at multiple levels and start helping folks build relationships in a way that works for them. So another great example in one of the handouts is from Rockford. So Rockford, Illinois, in Winnebago County has had a huge problem with sex trafficking and prostitution. And there are a couple of amazing advocates there that were aware of this problem, and they contacted CAASE and they started working with our policy director, Lynn Johnson, right around the time that all these EDI laws were being passed. And through community awareness and law enforcement trainings and prosecutor trainings, they have been able to flip the script, for lack of a better term, on who is being held accountable for the fact that this commercial sex trade exists. Instead of prostituted women being arrested, there are now more arrests of buyers. And that is because they have been very diligent in working with law enforcement, paying attention to what they're doing and making sure that when a prostituted person is arrested, the public defender knows that there's an affirmative defense. And that's important. That's another really important point of engagement around these laws. I worked in a community recently where they're very concerned about businesses that operate as fake massage establishments. Okay, and the concern is, or when most of the time when these businesses are raided, the women are arrested. And my question was, well, why are the women being arrested? And the answer was, well, if we can get to them, we can get to the people above them. And that's just not how prostitution and sex trafficking works. It's not a drug deal. Most often, those women get this misdemeanor conviction. They don't show up to court, and it's not really doing anything about the trafficking problem. And so we're working with them to maybe circumvent that by creating a massage establishment license that might
that would give them the power to shut down the business without having to set up a sting, which is very costly and time intensive, resource intensive. And it's not really effective because oftentimes the people in that business just go somewhere else and continue to do what they're doing. So my point here is that it's a very localized response, and it really depends on what the problem looks like. So, I don't have that much more. Please feel free to ask any questions. But I also brought this What is EDI handout for all of you. If you want to get involved, please feel, my email is on there. Please feel free to call me. Oh, actually, sorry, I do have one more thing, the challenges. So there are some other challenges that I talked to the DHS folks about, and one of them is how complicated it is to get the money into these funds. And so DHS has published 2 separate letters, one to law enforcement and one to all the state's attorney's offices, explaining what this looks like. So they've been made aware, but it's just about reminding them that this fund exists and this is how it works. The second problem is that when that law passed 2 years ago, there was $100,000 of general revenue fund that was supposed to be allocated to go into our special fund to get it started. But we've never passed a budget, that's just never happened. And so that brings us to the third challenge, which is that we need legislators to get really creative about other sources of funding for prostituted and trafficked people. And so that might look like a day where $1 of every lottery ticket is put into the fund, is collected and put into the fund. Or maybe $1 tax on every sporting ticket sold on a given day that's taken and put into the fund. So there are a lot of different ways that legislators can think creatively around prioritizing this issue and getting money together to start that statewide system of services. That's all I have.
So we don't have a roving mic, I'm sorry, so I'm going to have to ask the speakers to either use this mic or to speak up. And if you don't mind, first I wanted to thank you so much for your presentations and for the work you're doing. I have a couple of questions I'm going to ask to start the ball rolling, if you don't mind. And that is, first, you mentioned, if I understood it correctly, that a large percentage of the runaway girls within 48 hours enter the sex trafficking industry. And you said, Donna, you said that that a lot of people do it because they have no place to live, and they have to have money for a meal and so on. Do you know if the overall incidence of people joining this industry, entering the industry, is increasing? And either way, do you know what can we do to protect in these first 48 hours to try to protect them and provide them with these resources so they can, in fact, not be forced into this industry?
Right. So I don't have trend data. I mean, a lot of the statistics we have are a few years old. It's very difficult to collect data on this population. So a lot of it is estimates. A lot of it comes from when Heather showed the hotline poster. So some of the information we get is from Polaris, who runs that hotline, from the calls they get, which of course is not a true statistic on the incidents. It's who calls the hotline. So to answer that part, I don't have trend data. I don't know if anyone else really does. I haven't seen any. In terms of the first 48 hours, great question. So, kind of thinking more upstream, what can we do to prevent youth from running away? So how can we build up family support? How can we make sure that you know, I mean, some of this is economic justice, making sure that people have jobs, and so there's not so much stress on families. And so there's equal pay and paid sick leave and kind of all the supports that people need to support their family, right? So some of that, and then of course we know drug problems and, you know, mass incarceration. So the, you know, building up the family. So I'm just trying to think a little more upstream. And then as Melissa said, working with group home workers. How can they better serve the needs so that the kids in the homes aren't running away? So I think there's multiple levels, and I think the work that CAASE is doing that, you know, we would also love to get involved with in terms of, and we're doing a little bit of sort of training professional groups to be more responsive to the needs.
So, Melissa, can I just ask you before we answer, part of the answer is the question is, what educational programs are being provided to the prospective runaways, and how are they being told what lies ahead of them in this first 48 hours, and what opportunities are we giving them in terms of organizations that they can run away to, so they're not forced into this industry?
I don't know that anyone plans to run away.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I agree. But when, as you were asking that, I saw that there's this night ministry poster on the wall over there. Night ministry works. You know, they have a van. I think a couple of vans that go around the city, and they are able to do interventions with runaway youth. And you know, so I think some of those, you know, having more services like night ministry that can intervene in that first 48 hours. There's just not enough of them, and that would really be my only. I think that's the only really reasonable way to intervene with, you know, young people who are obviously in crisis and have left home. There needs to be someone kind of where they're at, which in that case is the streets.
Heather, did you want to say something?
Well, it just made me think, I don't have a statistic or anything, but in my other hat, I am a yoga teacher, and I have been teaching yoga at the Cook County Jail in the women's division. A lot of those women are also prostituted women. They don't end up in jail anymore because of that. So they might end up in jail. It's usually drug-related offensive or shoplifting. And they get some great services in the women's division at Cook County. My understanding is most of their pimps and johns know that day they're released and where they're released. So when they leave the program, they're often taken immediately back into the life they were living before, and so I know there's been some talk about that's the problem. There's sort of this gap. We need somewhere for these people to be able to go to continue receiving services, and I mean they're sort of left without a choice. And I think it's the same. I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think it goes to education and providing more social services, which I think if anything, it's going the other way, less social services.
You want, Nikki?
Once sex trafficked, how long sex trafficked, and how do you rescue someone like that? Like, this is 20,000 people, 20,000 women and girls a day just in Chicago. How long, and then the average age is 11 or 12? What do they have, 2 decades in there? 3 decades, a whole lifetime?
Right. So one of the statistics that we use is that we have heard is that 7 years is the average, basically the average lifespan once someone gets into trafficking, because of homicides, and I can't remember the other reason is. Addiction. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. So
addiction,
I mean,
HIV.
Thank you.
AIDS.
So there are, obviously, we work with survivors who've been out for 15 years and we're in different, so there are exceptions. I mean, that's an average. And it's difficult to get out. So there's a group, a nonprofit in Chicago, some of you might have heard of, called the Dreamcatcher Foundation. And it was formed by a survivor, Brenda Myers-Powell. There's a film that it's about her and her work. And she does street outreach. And so she, you know, when she hears about young women, and she also works in schools with young women at risk, And so she'll take someone out for coffee, and she knows she's not gonna pull them off the street. And I saw the film for the first time just last month, and, you know, there's no come with me now, because it takes a while. A lot of the people who are being trafficked, they blame themselves, they think that they are in love with their trafficker, they're sort of brainwashed, very similar to domestic violence, and that, well, you know, if I would have done this right, then, you know, I probably wouldn't have gotten beaten up. And so it's not like plucking people out of slavery, right? It's not like it's not like unchaining them and taking them in. So it's a very difficult process, and where she's been at this for years and years now. And I mean, I know she has helped some women leave their situations. And certainly CAASE works with people who are out and who are trying to expunge the records and all that, but it's a difficult, lengthy process.
I just say I'll agree. I think it's about meaningful options and alternatives available if and when you're ready to leave the life. And that looks different for every individual. So I think it's just important that we accept that, and that we accept that survivors of prostitution are just that. They're survivors, and they're very smart, resourceful people. They just happen to be in this situation. So when they are ready, for example, if there's a community drop-in center that allows someone to come in and say, I need a shower, I need this and that for 5 hours, but you might not see me again for 6 months, that place should still allow that person to come back in 6 months. So I think it's more about the philosophy of the organizations that are addressing these issues with women, and that they are run by survivors. I think it's very important.
Just another footnote in there, I represented a woman through CAASE, and it wasn't in a court proceeding, but she had been sexually assaulted. She had gone to a concert. I think she was probably slipped some sort of pill in her drink, so her memory was in and out a bit, but she was sexually assaulted by someone performing that evening. And I spent months trying to advocate just with the police officer who came to the scene. Eventually she was taken by ambulance to the hospital, to advocate on her behalf that she wanted charges pressed, and they never were. And so the education has to almost start at such a basic level. I mean, first of all, the police officer's his beat was off at 6 a.m. So I was trying to get up at 5 a.m. to just get in touch with him. He would never call me back. And then when I get him, it would sort of be like, well, what was she doing there? Why'd she get in his van? What's the matter with her? And this was the police officer. And I think CAASE has taken great strides in educating, but it's so complicated because it's an issue that's ingrained in all levels of our society. I mean, another program, which Melissa can probably speak more about, that CAASE I think is doing phenomenal work in, is their outreach program in high school. And I've talked to Caleb, who's facilitated some of those programs, and he'll go into, an average high school, meet with a group of young men, and at the beginning of class be like, so how many of you would go to a strip club if you can't, How many of you have been to a strip club? And they go through this 4 or 5 week session, and they really talk about what these women at strip clubs, have, why they're there, their lives. By the end, most of them, now how many of you do you think you'd go to a strip club or have a stripper come, and it's no one. And these aren't bad kids, in my opinion. It's just sort of society's effect of not looking past, well, she must want to do it, I'm giving her $50, and that's, strippers, that's sort of one of the first inroads to becoming trafficked and prostituted out. So.
Gary. We've talked a lot about the legislation, and it's admirable, but are we make much progress in getting the infrastructure, getting the pimps off the street? I mean, if you take a pimp off the street and you get rid of 4 or 5 people, get rid of, that seems to be something we're not talking about.
Right. Well, that's the whole end demand campaign. But I think that goes back to all the training, which is why, and Melissa could probably speak to this better than me, but a year or two ago, CAASE sort of said, okay, we have all these laws in effect that should be helpful. Now we have to figure out how to enforce that. And so now they're working, Melissa is on that side of, that's taking a lot of outreach and education.
So, the thing about pimps and traffickers is that they are actually truly the invisible ones in this whole economy, right? The buyers and the prostituted people are out there. They can be seen interacting, wherever it is, whether it's a car, a hotel, or online. But pimps often, even in online sex trafficking, they often have the women or the prostituted person post an ad for themselves because they're being coerced to post that ad. And so that interaction it's very hard to prove. And so when you talk to law enforcement, they have a very hard time with that. And a lot of that work is also done on the federal level because traffickers tend to move prostituted people from state to state. So our focus, not that it is on pimps and traffickers, but we start with buyers because they drive the demand. And so that's kind of just where we're at in our state. And that's not to say that there won't be creative solutions to combat local traffickers. It just means that right now there's a lot of coordination that has to happen with federal law enforcement. So in Cook County, we have the Cook County Human Trafficking Task Force where the U.S. attorney sits and the state's attorney, and they are able to coordinate and collaborate on cases. And so that's one way that they address traffickers. And so I sit at the steering committee meetings, so I know that there are at least a few cases every year where pimps and traffickers are prosecuted. It's just few and far between.
Yes.
So I have two questions, and they're very separate, but one is purely definitional from a legal perspective. Because we use words like traffickers, pimps, johns, buyers, and users, so those 5 words. And 2 or 3 of them, it's very easy to define. But I don't know the difference between a pimp and a john. Would you mind giving us, just because from a legal perspective, it'd be interesting to understand how there's different gradations.
I believe a john is someone who purchases sex. Right.
Okay.
And a pimp is someone who manages the workforce, right, the prostituted people. And then the traffickers, you're sort of, maybe you want to take this, but I think the people who organize, right, and who manage the pimps, as it were.
So so pimps are, and Heather, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Pimps, I think, are under pimps and traffickers promote prostitution, and buyers patronize a prostitute. Okay, so those are those would be the statutes that they would be violating. Buyers also solicit sex. And then traffickers also fall under the involuntary servitude. So the involuntary servitude of a minor, and trafficking in persons, which is supporting trafficking. So that might be a business owner or someone who owns the building that trafficking is happening, and might fall under trafficking in persons. So those are the 6 different laws that you can violate, and that money would go into the special fund. And if I'm talking with EDI laws specifically, that's kind of the breakdown. I don't know
So to draw an analogy, if you're selling drugs, there's a certain penalty, but if you're selling drugs within 1,500 feet of the school, there's a much more severe penalty. So I'm just wondering do the laws coordinate between, for example, a trafficker versus a pimp? Is it a more severe punishment if in fact someone is prosecuted?
I don't know if it's statutorily mandated that it's. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's statutorily mandated under the Creditors Accountability Act. I would assume that might be. Maybe it's in the criminal code, and I don't know. But it's a good one. Great question.
Follow up with you with a better answer when I have the laws kind of in front of me. I'm sorry, I just don't have them.
No, that's okay. And then the second question, which is totally separate, but again, I'd like to draw a parallel. Maybe it's places I go, but I can't walk into a public bathroom without seeing one of Shalva's little cards on the back of the door. that says if you're a victim of domestic abuse or violence, that, here's a number to call. And so to your point about abusers, I agree with you. Nobody plans that they're gonna run away, okay? So how can you educate them other than maybe in their mainstream classes? But who's to say whether these are kids who are going to those classes in school in general? But so someone runs away and I mean, what is the harm? And I know we've all debated it back and forth whether or not to have a poster up. But again, that shallow little postcard, I think everybody knows who goes to those bathrooms, that there's a number to call. And just for people, for kids, for people to have a number or someplace that they knew they could reach out to reach out for help or services or anything, maybe not 48 hours, but shortly thereafter. Maybe if you take the population number down from a 7-year average in the life to a 6.5-year, isn't it worth it?
I mean, here's my initial cup response. From conversations I've had with people at CAASE mostly is the problem is, you might be in a smaller town or even a bigger town and your safety is very compromised, but you want to leave, so you run away, you call this number, I believe you're going to get patched to local law enforcement. They might not know what to do with you. There's no safe house for you to go to. So the fear is that there's really no services set up to get. I mean, I know there are suicide hotlines that are like phenomenal because they have licensed psychologists, hopefully to be able to help someone at that moment of crisis. So when I talk about the education piece, I think the education is not for the victims that are being trafficked. It's more for just the general public to be like, oh, look at that sign. I had no idea this was happening in Chicago. Right.
Definitely for public awareness, that this happens.
The gentleman in the back?
Yes, first I'd like to ask if you could talk a little louder because it's hard to hear everything.
Sorry, sure.
But I speak loudly. I think you can hear me, right? Because having grown up in the Chicago slums, near West Side, and living in Chicago for 68 years, I know one thing. You cannot do human trafficking, drug trafficking, any kind of illicit trafficking in Chicago without the cooperation of law enforcement. So to what extent is law enforcement in silent partnership with the pimps to promote and perpetuate this terrible exploitation of young children?
Thank you for the question. I was wondering when someone was going to ask about Chicago because we haven't addressed Chicago. So,
I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. There's no way for me to know how much law enforcement is in collaboration with traffickers. I can't even comment on it, but I'm not telling you. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying I don't know.
How long have you been in Chicago?
7 years.
Okay, I'll take you up to north side of Chicago, and I will show you police on Lincoln Avenue at the motels taking money from pimps in broad daylight.
I believe you. I just...
It's good to get out in the field sometimes.
well, and maybe it's partly that holding our legislators accountable for, cracking down on this, or mayor, maybe. Right, chief of police. Yeah, I think we all agree that law enforcement needs to be doing more everywhere. And I know that in the past couple of years, CAASE reached out to us to ask if we have, through JCAST, contacts with the mayor's office because they weren't able to get an appointment with the mayor to talk about this, to try to educate him and hold him more accountable. So I don't know if anything's happened in the last year on that, but I do know that not so many inroads have been made in Chicago with law enforcement. And people from all walks of life pay for sex, from judges all the way down the line in law enforcement. So we know that. I can't speak for Chicago, but we know nationally that happens.
I mean, one way we can hold people, the system and law enforcement accountable is, for example, in Lake County, I'm doing a community awareness event, and we've asked the sheriff, who already coordinates with the Cook County Sheriff on his National Day of John's Arrest, to come and speak to the community about what the local response is, and just to make them aware of, hey, like, for him to say publicly, you know, we are addressing demand for the commercial sex trade. Now, this is a decent law enforcement officer who's already working on this, but the more that message is out there and the community hears it, the more they're able to hold the law enforcement that's not being so responsible accountable, right? So if we can do that type of community awareness event everywhere and always have a law enforcement person present, we're just increasing that relationship building, accountability factor that's really important.
Yes.
I have a question about your statement that kids don't plan to run. I think that's probably, in my experience, not the case. I think kids, in fact, do plan to run, and that there's a long period of time, or a short period of time, to the extent that kids who don't have frontal lobe development fully for executive reasoning do make plans. And that by the time a kid runs, we've already failed them. There are multiple systems failure. There are adults in that child's life who have missed all of the signs. There are teachers and social workers and religious leaders and community people who this kid passes through their lives and we just ignore them. And that the education has to really be rolled back to say everybody needs to be aware of this. And I just kind of put that out there.
Yes, absolutely. I guess what I meant is, you know, in terms of planning, and like you said, the frontal lobe development, teenagers that, well, I think I might run away, and gee, how am I going to get that next meal? I mean, they're not, you know,
right.
I have 2 teenagers. I mean, I don't think that's right here. So that's what I mean, and I totally agree, and tried to talk about that a little bit in terms of, you know, how can we intervene early to have the supports that kids and families need. So, you know, I don't want to put the whole burden on schools, but of course there's not enough support in schools. And social workers can't see every kid in tiny areas, you know, where families are low income or drug addicted, or, you know, families where they're broken up because of incarceration and, or, you know, kids, I mean, we know that on the I live on the North Shore. So on the North Shore, there's parents who are there and not present. And kids are very disconnected from their families for many reasons, whether it be prior sexual abuse or my parents are never around and I have no rules and they want to be my friend and so they're not parenting, and, you know, all the things that could lead to, and so then when someone's strict, I'm going to run away. So, you know, there are so many points of intervention, and I agree. Thank you for bringing that up. Great point.
The gentleman in the sweater.
Yeah, by your definition, it doesn't sound like many victims of prostitution aren't also victims of sex trafficking. To what extent is that the case? And also, what is the risk of suicide among sex trafficking victims?
So CAASE's response to that would be that sex trafficking wouldn't exist without prostitution, and the demand for prostitution, the demand to buy sex. So sex trafficking is kind of a subset of prostitution as a whole, right? And sex trafficking is a subset of human trafficking as a whole. So we sort of use those terms, I sometimes use those terms interchangeably, kind of depending on who I'm talking to, and if I'm, you know, there's like the legal definition of prostitution, and sex trafficking is kind of a larger term that we use in the field. I don't know if that's helpful. And do you have the suicide question?
Well, I didn't show the slide, but, you know, from statistics we've seen, more than 70% of people who are prostituted report, for instance, 76% report that they've been beaten by a pimp, 79% beaten by customers. So when there's force, fraud, or coercion according to the law, that means sex trafficking. So it really is a majority, up to 80 or even higher percent of people who are prostituted who meet that definition of sex trafficking. So I'm sorry if we didn't speak that correctly. I don't have any statistics. I've never seen a statistic on suicide either. Great question. I have not seen that either.
Yes.
So I'm from a rape crisis center that serves Lake County and parts of Cook County. And I know, so I oversee our volunteer program, and a lot of them are also really passionate about specifically sex trafficking, but human trafficking as well. And because the problem can be really hard to like pinpoint in different communities, I think it's really hard for people to figure out
like how they can get involved, even if they really want to. So what would you say are some really practical ways that people can start, like, other than, I think, education and learning more about the issue, really stepping in and fighting, like, sex trafficking or human trafficking?
So one of the things that I'll go first, I'm sure you have lots of answers too. So one of the things that we've done, and I'm sorry I didn't bring them up, but we can email them out. We have letters that actually we've gotten from CAASE that people can write, can customize to mayors in municipalities, the chief law enforcement officer, and mayor head of the municipality, letting them know about the law with the fund, and so that is education, but it's getting directly to people, to law enforcement and municipalities. And so that's an advocacy action, and we've had a synagogue do that on a kind of a good deeds day. So that's something where a mayor got 40 letters in one day, in a couple different cities. And so we have found that's very helpful. People who want to get involved working directly with survivors, then Sail of Freedom. And we really, I know you say decide awareness, but we feel like we're still in the awareness building phase. And so we recommend people, we say all the time, help connect us with your congregations, your whatever clubs you're in. Jacqueline, raise your hand, she's our engagement director for JCAST, and she recently spoke to a Rotary, and from that, can you come talk to my Optimist Club too? And so, thinking about all of the networks we're in and how important it is, and chambers of commerce, we'd love to get involved with chambers of commerce, because it's businesses who are required by the law to hang those posters. So there are a number of ways, from direct service to awareness to the policy that we try to get people to do. But I agree, sometimes it's, what can I do? What can I do? And it is sometimes tricky to find that exact fit, because it's, as Melissa said, federal law enforcement are really the ones working and getting the pins. So what can I do as an individual in that way? But there are a lot of things we can do as individuals.
I pretty much second everything that you said. Also, it's specifically with the end demand work that I'm doing, it's about relationships. So for some attorneys, it's about helping facilitate an attorney training, or it might be if you want to volunteer locally. Traffic Free just opened a drop-in center, and they're always looking for volunteers. Just another plug.
Yeah, in CAASE, I think if you write down their website, it's really user-friendly with different programs they have going on and different ways to get involved.
I have two questions. My first one is, a moment ago you were talking about how at the New Orleans division at the jail, their pimps are waiting for them because they know where they're going to get out and when they're going to get out. But I think that Sheriff Yard's work on this issue is truly exemplary. And I am certain that a couple of years ago I read an extensive report in the Chicago Tribune that he was offering a program for women survivors who didn't want to go back to that lifestyle after they were released, that there was a program. I realized it was a small program. I just wanted to ask you, are you indicating that that program's been eliminated, or that program is not as robust as it should be? Does that program still exist? Because as I recall, that program was being facilitated by two women that used to be victims.
It was Dreamcatcher. So,
well, it seems to me that it was, but I didn't want to say that. I wasn't positive. I couldn't quite remember.
I mean, I'm just trying to think, because I don't know that Dreamcatcher does specific survivor work, like a program. I mean, there are, like you said, safe houses, and there's a program run by the Salvation Army, but it's only open to young women who are under age 18.
Right.
So there's pockets, and so Freedom is filling a gap, but again, it's a small home. So I don't know that there's any kind of longer term program. I mean, it's a huge problem in our state that there's no state funding. I love the ideas that Melissa was talking about the lottery money or tax on soda or whatever it was for a day to, you know, obviously, a huge problem in our, I mean, even before the budget crisis, the state wasn't putting money into this fund. That was before the budget crisis. So certainly we know, and, you know, how else do you get these services funded? I mean, besides private funds, and we're all, you know, existing on private funds, of course.
So did I misunderstand what am I
I don't remember the
remembering it quite
article.
right? Because I thought that it was a program that he was making it a point of letting women know that when their sentence was over, that these women were available to help them make a transition. So is that something that?
So Dreamcatchers, about 2 or 3 years ago was when that article came out. So part of what they were doing is that they were helping with the transitional piece, and where do you go next? What do you do next? Where do you go next? It is my understanding that they are doing more outreach, on-street outreach, and just trying to have the conversations, and I know you're not ready to get out, but I'm here for you. Are you safe? Do you need condoms? You know, those kinds of things. If I can just speak for housing just for a moment. Sure. So Sail of Freedom is coming in with housing, and we just opened up, we have 3 survivors. I believe we can go up to probably 11 survivors in that house eventually. It's a pretty large home. We'll be bringing our 4th one in, I think, next week. So we have a 2-phase model. So what we did is we opened up residential first here because we were gifted a home in the north. And then we'll roll into what our 2-phase model is. And so we have a home that was gifted to us 45 minutes north of North Shore. It is an 11-bedroom home. It will have 22 survivors. It's all women, 18 and older. And that's an assessment home. That is the first 2 to 4 weeks. And so what we will do eventually with that is that we will be connecting with, because we're all about collaboration, we're not about coming in, here we are, let's just take over, but being able to also go into the jails and having conversations, and when you're ready, we have this assessment house, because this is what we do in Florida. We have this assessment house for you to go to. It's the first 2 to 4 weeks. It gives everyone a chance to see, is this a right fit for you? Do you in fact need to be in a long-term residential? Can you stay in the Chicago, Wisconsin, the Illinois, Wisconsin area? Do you have to be moved somewhere else because of safety? And there's a lot of factors of how and why someone goes into a long-term residential program.
Yeah.
But that will then give 22, about 30 beds or more, you know, in this area, which is a lot of beds. Considering, not considering the problem.
No,
but considering when you look at beds.
Doubles or triples what we have.
Right, because we have less beds in the United States for victims of sex trafficking than we have for pets. And I'm a dog owner. I'm a pet lover. So when I say that, it's hard. Okay? But yeah, and it's the same thing with domestic violence.
Well, my second question along those same lines is, clearly from the laws that have the improvements and statutes that we've done in Illinois over the past several years is really remarkable. I'm not asking you this to put you on the spot, but do you have a lobbyist right now in Springfield? Clearly you've got some legislators that you've been working very closely with that's been going on for some long while. And they're very sympathetic, I know, because if they weren't, you wouldn't have been this successful with these laws. Do you have anyone right now, either a lobbyist or perhaps you've got a legislator that's working on this grand bargain right now, so that even if you don't make it into this grand bargain, I'm sure it won't be the last one, and it's such a travesty that your $100,000 never got there. Do you have a seat at the table right now with the negotiations that are going on in Springfield?
Are you talking about the budget negotiations?
Yes.
Are you guys part of the Responsible Budget Coalition? Do you know? At the National Council of Jewish Women, we're members of the Responsible Budget Coalition, but you know, it's a huge, I mean, hundreds of organizations are part of that coalition, which certainly has lobbyists down there. The way the law was set up, it was set up so there would never be state funding. It wasn't set up for state funding.
Right, I understand.
So it would be, it would be changing the legislation versus just asking for the money, which, you know, all these other organizations who aren't getting paid. So I'm just gonna say, you know, from my perspective, that it's it's a tricky time to be, trying to get funding like that. I don't know if case,
I
with
think
respect to this.
that's pretty accurate. I don't know, I think that was what was promised to us. I don't know that was in writing ever. I wasn't there, so I'm not sure.
But one more point I just want to make, when you said must have been strong support, that nationally as well as in Illinois, there has been for the laws that have passed, and nationally there is a Trafficking Victims Protection Act, strong bipartisan support, which is fascinating. I mean, it's child protection and whatever other reasons, so there really is. I just want to echo that.
Yes.
To what extent are you aware, or are you doing, or are others doing, training of first responders to identify that a trafficking situation is taking place? And that might also include the police. I mean, if they get more and more, I'll use the word referral, which sounds terrible, but if they get more and more demand put upon them because people know that this is taking place. I know in New York, cab drivers now have to see a 1-hour film about it. There was the Uber driver out in California who recognized it. There was just on the news the other night, a stewardess on one of the airlines recognized it and offered this woman to get help. Is that another avenue that can be utilized to try and get more people, aware, and kind of putting demand on the police and on others to do something?
I think that's part of the community awareness raising and talking to community members about who needs to be trained and trying to set those up kind of individually. And there just has to be the local will to do that.
Well, it strikes me that some of it is beyond. I think Polaris worked with hotel staff to train them to recognize, because hotels are a hotbed for trafficking, and particularly around sports events. Transportation centers are another location. I'm familiar with the fact that like the trucking industry is really, really supportive of both putting up the hotline posters, recognizing what's going on, getting the women out if they can, or to local police and things like that. I'm just wondering, is anybody sort of thinking? Yes, it requires local, but there's also
Cook County
demand.
Human Trafficking Task Force has a training subcommittee, and they gather resources for a variety of different types of people. So I think there's healthcare worker trainings that we can share, and so when I say local efforts, that's like a resource that I can share with folks in Bloomington that don't necessarily have those resources, but they could come up here for that training. And so I've been allowed to share that information, and that's kind of what I mean. If someone in Bloomington has to tell me that there's an interest in that, and there's not a lot of people kind of doing that kind of resource connection, which is the problem. It's not that those trainings don't exist.
Right, so as you know, so the person who's asked that question is my co-chair of JCAST, who wrote this, thank you. And as you know, we did the training for retired social workers, and so we have kind of a training model, and there are other organizations. One of the things we've done last year is done a little bit of an assessment, what other organizations are doing training of first responders, but in terms of laws and policies, great question about who is required to get the training. So, people probably know that people in the I don't remember what the field is. So people work in salons have to be trained in domestic violence now, and so it kind of intersects. And the domestic violence folks and the training they do, and they're well networked together, have also been learning about sex trafficking, certainly. So people who work in domestic violence services and all that. So there is a lot of work. I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of work for us to do.
If someone was suspicious, what is the course they should take? Is it best to call legal? Law enforcement, or basically if they thought something was going on?
Probably a National Human Trafficking Hotline, that number that's on the posters, because they will be able to best direct them to the right folks to answer that, or the right folks to answer that question. I think if you were just to call the police, you might not get the response that you were looking for. But they do that type of coordination.
So I have another question. Go ahead, Sherry. So I have a different question. That is, and and I don't want anybody to read one way, think that I feel this way or that way when I ask this question, but I want you to the following question. With respect to the sexual abuse of children, we had programs on that, and I've written about that. We have mandated reporter rules. That's an unusual thing to have a mandated reporter rule. It's, some people don't like the idea of putting obligations on people to contact police. Some people do. With respect to this problem, there's so many different, you could fragment this problem, this industry, into so many different types of problems. Where there's physical force use, where there's coercion but not physical force, where there's simply a need for support, and people want money, they feel forced into it. It could be a different kind of scenario, different kind of solution. But before doing that, I just want to know what people think, and I'm asking actually not just to the panel members, but to the people in the audience, what they think. When do we decide that a problem is so significant that we should have a mandated reporter obligation? Not that people look the other way. In some states, in New Jersey, for example, every person is a mandated reporter for sexual abuse of children. Every person. It's even questioned when some states, in 2 or 3 states, even practicing attorneys with their clients have to disclose the information despite the ethics rules. That's how strong it is. Personally, I don't see the internet, and so on, I don't see that this is a battle that we're winning. That's why I asked before about the incidents. I don't think this is a battle that we're winning. And if this is a serious enough battle, then maybe we have to think about serious steps. But I just wonder what people think about, maybe you don't like mandating reported for sexual abuse of children, I don't know. But what do you think? Is this something that we should do something more drastic than what we've been doing? Yes.
I'm going to speak as a survivor. Okay? So speaking from the survivor side of 14 years of incest, okay, and then being in the life for 4 years, in my opinion, every single person is a mandatory reporter. And sex trafficking of children, that is childhood sexual abuse. Okay? And so it shouldn't matter, I don't want to get in trouble, or legally I'm not a mandatory reporter. It's, you want it to happen to your own child, then be a mandatory reporter. And just take it upon yourself.
You know, so that should the law impose on us an obligation to report? People in certain industries, just as in Illinois, not everybody is a mandated reporter for sexual abuse, even children, but people in certain industries who are most likely to be in a position to observe. So somebody who mentioned already, industries where people are trained specifically to notice things. Well, maybe part of the training maybe they should be required as well to report. Yes.
I have another question, and Heather, you might know this. I know in the Cook County system there are domestic violence courts, and NCJW actually has a program called Court Watch where people go into the courts, pay attention to what's going on. A summary report is made available to the chief judge who oversees all that, and he has found it very helpful, and changes have been made. Is there any one court or something like that where the women who have been prostituted or trafficked go to, where a similar kind of program could be set up with quote-unquote court watchers watching what the police do, what the judges do, what the attorneys do, what the PDs do, something like that?
There's a court in Cook County, like a divergent prostitution court. Sorry, there's a prostitution court in Cook County.
In 555?
Yes, it is in 555. And it's a good court. It's a good program. And the requirements of the women in the program are very tailored. But as represented in this case, we advocate for a non-criminal system response to prostituted people. They should never have been in court in the first place. And if we are calling these people trafficking victims, then they are actually subject to the affirmative defense. So if they can prove that they're a trafficking victim, they shouldn't be in court. So it's sort of just a waste of resources.
I actually misspoke. I really meant it to be more of the pimps and the johns. who might be brought into court. And, you know, where you hold the police accountable, the judges who are being more made aware of this and will actually fine or prosecute these individuals. Utilize, I should have said that.
That's an action plan that I suggest and will be suggesting to, in all of the trainings that we're doing around the state. It's just not a system that exists yet here. But in other states it does. There are John's courts and there are John's schools that are a result of being part of that court. So like part of your.
And then setting up, like I said, a court watch kind of program where you have volunteers go in who pay attention to what's going on. To what degrees are the judges doing what they're supposed to do? I mean, it's a non-technical thing because I'm not a lawyer, but we pay attention to what's going on in the court and how are people responding? How are they handling the people who are coming in and so on? It just might
I'm
be
not
another
sure how
answer.
many, frankly, cases there are against PIS and Johns.
Right.
It's not so hard to.
Not enough.
I mean, like.
I'd like to speak to your point about mandated reporters. You know, 30 years ago, over 30 years ago now, there was a hotline that was working on sexual abuse of students, meaning in grammar school and high school, and they were getting phone calls, and there was this question about mandated reporting, but the people that were answering that that phone, and as I recall, it did have limited hours, but they just said, look, these students are not going to talk to us if we're insisting that they tell us their name, tell us how to, find them, so forth and so on, because we have to report this. So I'm not saying that mandated reporting is bad. I'm just saying that there are certain circumstances where it might be more effective because it could be more practical. And I would like to see mandated reporting for the hospitality industry because I believe that in hotels, my research has shown me that there are too many, despite, what is the organization out of New York that works on trafficking and does hotel training?
It was Polaris, it's out of Washington.
No, it wasn't Polaris.
EPCAT?
It was.
EPCAT?
Yes, yes. There are hotels that say that they do that training, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but their security directors, their housekeeping directors, their GMs, those hotel, their front office directors, I would rather see the hotel industry have mandated reporting because I just believe that could be very practical and it just makes a lot of sense. And I think it could be doable.
Well, that's a question of licensure. I don't mean to interrupt, but that's where if you have registration in the state. So one of the things we found in the schools when we had mandated reporting, yes, now all teachers have to report if in fact they suspect abuse of a child. But what we then found is many children didn't want to come forward or say something. So you have now the big app thing that we do in all the schools is text a tip. And it's completely secretive, but it's to let someone in authority know that that may be going on so the teachers can report, but it's not coming from a particular source.
Right.
But a lot of that is all tied to state regulation. So the same way as someone who is a manicurist has to get a license, so someone who is a hotel and is paying exorbitant city and state taxes, as we all know anyhow, why wouldn't they in fact have to, when they renew their license after inspection, after their elevator inspection, tied to something as trivial as that, but so then they are required to have their staff trained or go through something so they know to look for what signs and then to report it and put the obligation on that.
Just sort of a follow-up, isn't it illegal for a hotel to be a host for sex trafficking? And wouldn't they be subject to civil litigation?
Training
training is all good, but
You could prove it under the Predator
well,
Accountability
yes,
Act. Prove
yeah,
that they
of course you
had
have to
knowledge,
prove
right?
it. But didn't we see statistics that some women were forced to do acts 20 to 50 times a day?
Right, and often they're in hotels.
Right.
Right.
So we have to have the law requiring, mandating reporters in the hotel industry, and there's no, and a companion act protecting the whistleblowers who go ahead and.
Is there such a law? I mean, is there such a law prohibiting hotels from hosting that sort of activity and subjecting them to civil
Like a
liability?
specific law to, I mean, I don't think so, that would be awesome.
There aren't many hurting things going on.
Yes.
I would say too, an important consideration for mandated reporting is also, and I don't know human trafficking specific what that looks like, but an individual's ability to self-report. Like, for example, in my role, I'm a mandated reporter always for child abuse, but for elder abuse, if that individual cannot self-report. And so part of it is, especially for human trafficking, like that person's situation and experience is going to be really sensitive and really like individual to them. So when you think about mandated reporting and someone coming in and at least, right, and part of it is that with human trafficking there isn't a lot of education. So you might have people who say, okay, well, I'm a mandated reporter, but don't know enough about something to really truly identify if the situation is trafficking or if it isn't, and what that looks like. And so, I don't know, in thinking about mandated reporting, also considering like what that looks like and how that can sometimes negatively impact someone. Where if there isn't a situation, maybe trafficking is happening, but the case was not reported properly or just enough information wasn't had, that can negatively impact that survivor of human trafficking, even if the effort and the intent was really positive.
So let me just say that, first of all, there are hotlines where people can report things anonymously. You can do that. But as to this, there's no solution, no policy is a panacea. And mandated reporting, for example, has problems as well. Even with the sexual abuse of children, there can be problems. There can be problems, for example, a lawyer represents a battered woman, and the battered woman, and who was sexually abusing the child? The battered woman's boyfriend, and she would, in the eyes of the law, might well be considered to be part of an accomplice, or after the fact, unless So she's trying to get relief from being battered. She explains to her lawyer what's going on in the family, and suddenly, if the lawyer is a mandated reporter, even though he's a lawyer, he's going to report on her as well as on the boyfriend. I mean, so no system is perfect. The question is, on balance, can you come up with some policy that will move us forward? I just want to mention to everybody that we have now we have like minus 1 minute, so we have a chance for maybe just one last question. Yes.
I'd like to just end this unhappy subject on an unhappy note. For the lady here who asked about following up the judges, in my neighborhood years ago, there was a man of my nationality who had a woman who was a drug addict in her 30s, and she had two little girls, one 7 years old and one 11 years old. And this SOB, mind you, it was a couple blocks from my house, he was raping the little girls, giving the money to the drug addict mother money to rape the little 7 and 11-year-old girl, and making pornographic movies. So I read in the Tribune, he was arrested, taken to court. A few years later, I happened to be at 26 in California, so I went to the court files and I saw his file. What happened with Mr. Jimmy? Mr. Jimmy, he had a lawyer and he had a psychologist. The lawyer brings in a letter from the psychologist that says, Mr. Jimmy is suffering some kind of psychological problem. That's why he was molesting these little girls, 7 years old and 11 years old, and making pornographic movies. And what was the judgment? No fine, no jail, no nothing. He was excused as a psychologically defective person.
Well, hopefully things are changing, and we thank the presenters for all their work and all the people here.